I just finished watching King and Conqueror. Not that I'm much of a fan of the BBC these days, but that's a story for another day. King and Conqueror was nonetheless a fascinating watch. The sweep of English history, the drama of 1066, and of course the Norman invasion. But as I watched it, I found myself thinking about something deeper. Not just who won at the Battle of Hastings, but the aftermath and what these crucial moments reveal about civilization itself. Because whenever Western history gets told, we hear the same refrain, and we hear it all the time, whether it's in documentaries, travel shows, or polite dinner table history chats. You might be wondering what I mean by that. Allow me to explain. Most people say the centuries between Rome's fall and the Norman conquest were Europe's Dark Ages, a time when supposedly Christianity was in decline and Islam was burning bright. And then they follow that narrative by saying this was the Golden Age of Islam, or Islamic Golden Age, where the world was treated to advanced architecture, dazzling science, and civilized refinement. Michael Portillo just said exactly this on a travel show about Spain and Andalusia, and that's not just an innocent mistake. This kind of storytelling shapes how generations of Britons see their past. Many of them ashamed of their own inheritance and dazzled by a romanticized version of Islamic civilization that never existed. I'm looking at you, middle-class lefties. It's become the cliche of our age that Christianity was backwards and Islam was enlightened at this stage. But let's be honest, that's a load of nonsense. Absolute claptrap. Yes, Muslims built pretty mosques. Yes, they preserved and translated Greek texts. But the so-called Golden Age was built on the backs of conquered people. Slavery, plunder, and women captives of war booty. They call it a Golden Age, but really and truly it was golden for the conquerors, never for the conquered. It wasn't Islam that advanced science. It was Greek, Persian, and Indian knowledge preserved under Islamic rule, often by Christian and Jewish scholars working within Muslim empires. That doesn't mean there weren't moments of brilliance. Of course there were. But they flourished despite the theology, not because of it. And when the Islamic tide receded, what endured, what truly created progress, was indeed the Western path, the Christian path. And that brings us to England, 1066, the Battle of Hastings. Now, Hastings obviously wasn't Christians versus Muslims. It was Christian Anglo-Saxons versus Christian Normans. But here's why it matters. William's Normans were descended from Vikings, raiders who once lived much like the armies of Islam, plunder, slaves, and concubines. But by the time of Hastings, they were transformed. Christianity had redirected their culture. Christianity transformed vengeance into law, marriage into a sacred covenant, and kingship into stewardship. Step by step, it domesticated raw power. When William the Conqueror won at Hastings, he didn't hand women out as plunder. He handed out land and legitimized his conquest with oaths, coronation, and with the Doomsday Book. That's why I say Hastings is important. It shows the West had already set itself on a new trajectory. That trajectory was a civilization guided by law, honor, and marriage, not harems and women as spoils of war taken as property. Over time, these same Western ideals were codified in canon law, then in common law, and would eventually give rise to things we enjoy today: human rights, contracts, and consent. The moral revolution that began in the monasteries would centuries later echo in courtrooms and in parliament. Now focus on this, because this is where everything changes. Where Islam sanctified the harem, Christianity sanctified the home. That's where these two cultures completely diverge. Now, the clash didn't start at Hastings, but it shows the fork in the road, the moment the West demonstrated which path it had chosen. And what's more, within one generation of the Battle of Hastings, those same Norman knights had to march east to fight in the First Crusade against Islam. And there, at last, the two systems collided. The Christian trajectory of law and dignity versus the Islamic trajectory of jihad and sexual slavery. And we get to see this ideological battle in action. Now, when we talk about the Battle of Hastings, most people just remember it as the last time England was conquered. Harold Godwinson gets an arrow in the eye, William becomes the conqueror, and the Normans stamp their castles across England. But here's what nobody points out. Hastings didn't just decide who sat on the English throne. It symbolized a far bigger civilizational split. It shows us why the West took one path and why the Islamic world stayed trapped in another. Let's set the scene. In 1066, Islam had already been around for over 400 years. Muhammad's armies had exploded out of Arabia and swept across the Middle East, North Africa, Spain, and even pressed into Central Asia. And everywhere they went, they carried a very specific doctrine of war. You conquer, you take land, and you take women. The Quran itself sanctioned the sexual slavery of female captives. The Hadiths also record Muhammad taking concubines and distributing women as spoils of war. And most people don't realize the Quran doesn't just mention this once. It repeats it in Surah 23 and then again in Surah 70, almost word for word. That shows you how central this is to the doctrine. Entire slave markets from Baghdad to Cairo to Andalusia were stocked with women taken in jihad. Imagine a mother and daughter torn apart in a market, one sold to a palace, the other to a brothel. Both told it was the will of God. That was the reality beneath the so-called Golden Age. Now contrast that with England in 1066. William's Normans were descended from Vikings, men who had once raided monasteries, burned villages, and carried off women. But by the time William crossed the Channel, something had changed. The Normans had been Christianized. And under Christianity, the rules of war were different. Did atrocities happen? Of course they did. William himself carried out the harrying of the North, where villages were torched and entire populations starved. So yes, Christendom has blood on its hands, but there was a fundamental distinction. Even in brutality, the rules of war were different. Rape and the taking of concubines were condemned as sin, not sanctified as law. That's the civilizational difference right there. Islam institutionalized the humiliation of women as spoils of war. Christianity, for all its flaws at that time, elevated women into the protected sphere of marriage, family, and dignity. Knights proved their honor through marriage alliances, not concubines. The gap between Christendom and Islam is the gap that still, in my opinion, defines us today. Just 30 years after Hastings, the Crusades began. Christian knights marching east were shocked at what they saw when they reached the Levant. Entire economies were built on the open sale of slaves, and harems were filled with war captives and concubines celebrated as piety and manhood. Muslims, in turn, thought the Crusaders were hypocrites. Barbaric killers, yes, but somehow too moral to claim women as prizes. It was a clash not just of swords, but of civilization. In Antioch and Aleppo, crusading armies were stunned to see Christians being openly sold in slave markets. In Damascus, entire bazaars ran on human chattel. Women and children were trafficked as spoils of jihad. In Cairo, the Fatimid caliphs filled harems with concubines and staffed their palaces with castrated eunuchs. Even Baghdad, the so-called jewel of the Golden Age, was infamous for supplying women for harems and men for military slavery. And this is a question most people don't ask, and most Muslims have probably never confronted. Have you ever wondered why there are hardly any Black populations left in the Middle East today, despite the thriving Islamic slave trade? Strange, isn't it? Well, the dark reality is that when Africans were enslaved under Islam, many of the men were brutally castrated to serve as eunuchs in palaces and harems so they wouldn't engage in sexual relations with the women and produce children that might one day threaten or rival the seat of power. Most of these captured Black men didn't even survive the excruciating operation. The allegedly great Arab historian Ibn Khaldun, writing in the 14th century, even described sub-Saharan Africans as being dominated by nature and suited only for servitude. This wasn't just racism, this was plain and pure Islamic policy. Modern historians like Bernard Lewis and Murray Gordon also explain why the Middle Eastern slave trade left such little demographic trace compared to the Atlantic slave trade. In the West, as horrific as slavery was, Africans had children, families, descendants, and they essentially became part of the fabric of the Americas. In the Islamic world, however, slavery was not only brutal, it was demographically genocidal. The system literally, and I mean literally, cut Africans out of the gene pool. It erased bloodlines. That's why you don't see millions of Afro-descended populations in Saudi Arabia, Syria, Iraq, or Iran today. And here's the kicker. Those barbaric codes echo right down to the modern world. Here in the West, shaped by Judeo-Christian values and later the Enlightenment, dignity became the foundation. All people were entitled to thankfully live with it. It was a truth universally acknowledged. Slavery was abolished, women gained rights, and the individual mattered. Over centuries, Judeo-Christian societies became what we call high-trust societies, places where contracts, promises, and even handshakes carry weight. Why? Because morality wasn't enforced by terror alone. It was internalized through conscience, law, and culture. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, slavery lasted right into the 20th century. Saudi Arabia didn't abolish it until 1962. Women's rights lagged because the foundational text sanctified their subordination. And the so-called high-trust pockets of the Muslim world, like Dubai or Riyadh, let's be honest, are only high trust because they enforce it with the lash and beheadings or insanely disproportionate prison sentences. It's fear, not virtue. So when people today sneer at the Christian West and glorify Islam as some misunderstood underdog, they miss the real story. The reason the West became freer and richer and more stable isn't a mystery. It's because it, even at war, was pointing in a higher direction. A flawed direction at times, yes, but a higher one nonetheless. Harold Godwinson died at Hastings because he refused to yield. Was it pride? Honor? Ego? Probably all three. But what he represented, an English crown chosen by law, not by brute force, tells you everything about why Western civilization evolved the way it did. Even in defeat, there was dignity. And that's the lesson here, or at least the lesson I'm trying to portray. 1066 wasn't just the end of Anglo-Saxon England. It was the moment the West fully stepped onto its path, away from war booty and harems towards law, oaths, and dignity. A path that would lead to the Magna Carta, to enlightenment, and eventually to democracy, and values that we now call Western civilization. And yet, in Britain today, our leaders and media still romanticize the Islamic Golden Age while sneering, for the most part, at their own Christian heritage, as if we've forgotten which civilization actually climbed towards liberty. So next time you hear someone say, well, Islam and Christianity are just two sides of the same coin, remember Hastings. Remember the Crusades. Remember that one civilization was already trying to protect women, enshrine dignity, and build trust, while the other was still sanctifying slavery and humiliation as divine law from Allah. And then ask yourself, which world would you rather live in? The one that sanctified slavery as sacred law, or the one that imperfectly but relentlessly climbed towards freedom, dignity, and trust? History shows us one unshakable truth: not all cultures are equal. And the proof is in the pudding. In this case, it's written in human migration itself. Millions risk everything to flee Islamic tyranny for the freedom of the West, the very civilization they're taught to despise. Think about that for a moment. I hope I got my message through in terms of how vastly different these two civilizations are and why we still face some of the problems that we do today. Let me know in the comments what you think, and if I am onto something here about the different paths that the West and the Islamic countries have taken thus far. And I'm more than happy to engage in any opinions to the contrary. And if you haven't watched King and Conqueror yet, and you are averse to the BBC, as I was, do try and check it out regardless, because it does depict history and quite historically accurately from what I've read and cross-verified. So it most definitely is a good watch, although they have cast certain actors in it, which I'm sure are not reflective of actual 1066 Britain. But hey ho, it's still a good watch and gives you a glimpse into the glorious history of this country and why it should be taught and protected and respected. Despite its flaws, it is still far better than what many other cultures have attempted to do. And I stand by that. And it's part and parcel of the reason why I speak out. And I say over and over, time and time again, till I'm blue in the face, till the cows come home, that Islam and the West are absolutely incompatible with one another. So the fight for values and this ideological battle continues. And I'm here for it. I'm here to stay. And if you have stayed for this long in the video, then I thank you and I commend you for your concentration skills. Let me know what you thought in the comments. And once again, thank you to everybody who's reached out to me. And I will be going live soon to say thank you to all of you individually and celebrate the 50K that I never got to celebrate because of all of this upheaval. So yeah, stay tuned. I know it's corny, but please like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already. But please do like, share, and comment on this video so we spread it far and wide. And people realize the difference between how much of a privilege it is, and it should continue to be, to live in the West. It's not just something you should hand out willy-nilly to everybody that rocks up on these shores. That's not how it works. We need to understand that you've got values and interests that are in line with this country and that put this country first. I think we need to get a lot more serious and tough when it comes down to that. So yeah, I'll be back very soon with another video, but until then, ta-ra! If you like these videos and want to support me in my activism, then you can support me on Patreon or PayPal. Stay free, everyone!